Magnus Granger didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Vivian Ashcroft's office like he owned it already, dropped a folded document on her desk, and leaned back against the doorframe with the particular smile of a man who believed the conversation was already finished before it started. "Sign it tonight," he said. "I'm being generous. That number won't be on the table by morning." Vivian didn't look at the document. She looked at him. "Get out of my office, Magnus." He laughed, low, unhurried, the kind of laugh that meant he found her resistance entertaining rather than real. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him, because men like Magnus Granger never closed doors they expected to walk back through. The number on that document was half what the ranch was worth, and he knew it. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Because what Magnus did after she said no, that's where this story really begins. The advertisement ran on a Thursday, which Vivian later decided was either very good timing or very bad, depending on how you measured consequences. It appeared in the Laramie Weekly Courier, sandwiched between a notice about a missing plow horse and an advertisement for a new dry goods shipment expected from Cheyenne. 4 inches of column space. Plain language. No flourish. Wanted. Ranch foreman and general manager. Ashcroft Ranch, Harlan County, Wyoming Territory. Applicants must have verifiable experience managing large-scale cattle operations, supervision of ranch hands, and full accountability for livestock, land, and payroll. Wages competitive. Housing provided. Permanent position available for qualified candidate. Applicants respond in writing to Miss V. Ashcroft, Box 14, Laramie Post Office. Clause 7 of the employment agreement reads as follows. Should both parties, after a period of 30 days of employment, find the arrangement mutually satisfactory and wish to discuss the possibility of a formal domestic partnership, that is, marriage, this conversation may be initiated by either party without prejudice or obligation. Neither party is required to pursue this option. It exists only as a possibility, openly stated. The newspaper ran it without comment. The editor, a man named Forsyth, who had known Vivian's father, added a small note at the bottom that read, "Miss Ashcroft is a serious businesswoman, and this notice should be treated accordingly." He meant it as a shield. It didn't work. By Sunday, half of Laramie was talking about Clause 7. By the following Wednesday, people 3 counties over were talking about it. The laughter came first. Easy, careless laughter. The kind that doesn't require thought. A wealthy woman, 33 years old, unmarried, sitting on nearly 3,000 acres of prime cattle land, had put a husband clause in a job advertisement. The jokes wrote themselves. Women in dry goods stores whispered behind gloved hands. Men at cattle auctions shook their heads with knowing smiles. Someone in Cheyenne printed a satirical piece calling it the Ashcroft Matrimonial Employment Bureau and suggesting that applicants should bring not only their ranching credentials, but also their best Sunday suit. Vivian read the piece, folded the newspaper carefully, set it on the corner of her desk. Then she went back to reviewing the payroll discrepancies that her previous foreman, a man named Aldrich, who had left without notice 6 weeks before the first frost, had apparently been running for the better part of 2 years. She didn't have time for the jokes. She had a ranch hemorrhaging money from the inside, winter arriving ahead of schedule, and approximately 1,400 head of cattle that needed competent leadership before the ground froze solid. The laughter could wait. What she hadn't counted on, what she genuinely had not anticipated, was that the jokes would be louder than the advertisement itself. Men who might otherwise have applied, practical men with real experience who understood what the position actually offered, read the Clause 7 commentary and decided the professional humiliation wasn't worth the wages. Who wanted to be the man who answered the lonesome rich woman's husband notice? Even if you had no intention of pursuing that clause, the association alone was enough to make a serious man hesitate. Responses trickled in slowly. A 17-year-old boy who listed his primary qualification as strong back and willing attitude. a retired military officer who spent 4 paragraphs explaining why he was morally opposed to female land ownership before asking about the salary. 2 men who seemed to have misread the advertisement entirely and believed they were applying for positions as household servants. A brief, almost insultingly brief note from a man in Casper who wrote only, "I am available. I have cattle experience. The clause is of no concern to me. No name, no reference, just the postmark." She wrote back to the man from Casper requesting his name and references. He didn't reply. 3 weeks after the advertisement ran, Vivian sat at her desk at 11 o'clock at night with a lamp burning low and a cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around 9, staring at the stack of almost entirely useless responses, and allowed herself approximately 4 minutes of something that wasn't quite despair but was standing very close to it. Her father had built this ranch from nothing. 40 years of work. Her mother had kept the books through drought, years so bad that they'd gone 3 seasons without buying new boots. Vivian had grown up knowing the name of every water source on the property, every fence line, every grazing rotation. She had taken over management at 26 when her father's health began to fail, and she had run it, imperfectly, sometimes badly, but she had run it, through 3 difficult winters and 1 outbreak of blackleg fever that had taken nearly 200 head before they'd gotten it under control. She was not a woman who needed saving. What she needed was someone she could trust standing next to her when the decisions got complicated. Because the decisions lately had gotten very complicated, and she was running out of people she could trust. She closed the folder, picked up the cold coffee, drank it anyway, and went to bed. The response from Colton Hayes arrived 4 days later. It came in a plain envelope written on paper that was clean but not fine, in handwriting that was steady and clear without attempting elegance. He gave his full name. His age, 37. He listed 11 years working as a ranch hand and trail crew lead across 3 operations in Wyoming and Colorado, and he named references at each, not just employers, but foremen and fellow workers, which Vivian had learned meant more. A man's boss might speak well of him to avoid conflict. The men who worked beside him wouldn't bother with flattery. He addressed Clause 7 in 2 sentences near the end of the letter. I noted the clause. I am not applying because of it, and I am not applying in spite of it. I am applying because the position is one I believe I can do well. That was all. Vivian read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then she wrote back and asked him to come for an interview. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, just as the aspens along the North Ridge had gone full yellow, and the air had taken on that particular bite that meant the season was turning whether you were ready or not. He rode in on a solid bay horse, not flashy, built for work, and he came alone, which she'd half expected. A man with something to prove usually brought witnesses. He had nothing to prove, apparently, or at least he didn't think he did. He was taller than she'd pictured, lean in the way that came from actual labor rather than youth, with hands that had clearly been working since before the rest of him caught up. He took his hat off when he came into the office, not in a grand gesture of courtesy, but in the automatic way of someone who had been taught that it mattered, and he sat down in the chair across from her desk without waiting to be asked, which she noted. "You're Colton Hayes," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I've spoken to 3 of your references. All of them were more complimentary than I expected from people who presumably have nothing to gain from exaggerating." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "What were you expecting them to say?" "I wasn't sure. References can go either way. Sometimes they tell you the truth, and sometimes they tell you what they think you want to hear." She set his letter on the desk between them. "Holt Brannigan at the Double Creek outfit said you're the best cattle handler he's ever worked with. He also said you can be difficult when you think someone's wrong and you're convinced you're right." "He's not incorrect." "Which part?" "Both parts." He looked at her steadily. "I assume that's relevant to whether you hire me." "It's relevant to whether working together would be functional," Vivian said. "I've had foremen who were agreeable and told me what I wanted to hear. The last one left with 2 years' worth of discrepancies in the payroll records that I'm still untangling." She paused. "I'd rather have difficult and honest." "Then we probably won't have a problem." She asked him about the Clause 7, because she had decided she wasn't going to let it sit unaddressed in the corner of the conversation like furniture nobody wanted to talk about. I mentioned it because I believe in being straightforward about the terms of an agreement, she said. The position is a real position, and it pays real wages, and that is the job regardless of anything else. But I also believe that the people who work most closely with me need to understand the full picture of what this ranch is and what I'm trying to build. And part of that picture is that I'm doing it without a partner, and that at some point that may need to change. Not because I need someone to run it for me. Because running something this size indefinitely alone is... She stopped. Colton didn't rush to fill the silence. Harder than I expected, she finished. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise to maintain appearances. He was quiet for a moment, then, my last position ended because the ranch sold. Before that, I left because the owner brought in his nephew to manage the operation, and the nephew had ideas that were going to get people killed. I've never had trouble finding work, but I've never had ground under my feet that was mine. He paused. I'm not applying to this job looking for property that isn't mine. I want to be clear about that. You're saying you're not interested in the clause. I'm saying I'm not interested in your land. He met her eyes directly. The clause is a separate conversation, one that, as your advertisement said, may or may not ever happen. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a business context in 2 years. She hired him on the spot, told him wages and terms, gave him a tour of the bunkhouse and the main barn, and by Thursday of that same week he had already identified 3 fence sections that the Aldrich-era management had listed as repaired but had, in fact, not been touched. The crew didn't know what to make of him at first. There were 14 full-time ranch hands at Ashcroft Ranch, ranging in age from 19 to close to 60, with varying levels of competence and loyalty, and the particular skepticism common to men who have watched a series of bosses come and go and have learned not to invest too early in whoever arrived most recently. Colton didn't try to win them over. That was the first thing they noticed. He didn't make speeches or hold all-hands meetings or restructure anything dramatically in the first week. He showed up before anyone else. He knew what he was looking at when he walked the cattle pens, and when he gave an instruction, he gave it once and then watched to see whether it got done. And if it didn't, he came back and asked why, and not in a way that invited creative answers. By the end of the first week, the older hands had decided to wait and see. By the end of the second, the younger ones had figured out that the man genuinely knew what he was doing, which in their experience was rarer than it should have been. Vivian watched from a careful distance, which she was good at. She had learned early that the worst thing you could do as a manager was hover, that the presence of authority at every minor decision prevented people from developing the judgment to make decisions themselves, and she had disciplined herself to let her people work without constant observation. But she had also learned that distance required trust, and trust required evidence, and she was still accumulating evidence about Colton Hayes. She got some on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October. She had gone down to the main cattle pen to look at a heifer that one of the hands had flagged as potentially sick, and she came around the corner of the barn to find Colton in the middle of a heated exchange with a man named Russ Cleaver, who was the closest thing the outfit had to a senior hand, having been with the ranch for 4 years before Vivian inherited it, and 2 years after. Cleaver was a competent man, and Vivian knew it, but he was also the kind of competent that sometimes curdled into arrogance, and she had watched him test 3 successive foremen with low-grade deniable insubordination, the slightly too slow response, the instruction slightly modified, the suggestion ignored until he decided it deserved acknowledgement. She stopped at the corner of the barn and didn't announce herself. "I don't see why we need to change the rotation," Cleaver was saying. His voice carried the particular tone of a man who had decided the new foreman wasn't worth full effort yet. "We've been running the south pasture on a 3-week cycle since before you got here." "I can see that," Colton said. He wasn't loud. His voice was flat in a way that was somehow more authoritative than if he'd raised it. "I can also see that the south pasture is showing overgrazing on the east section, and the cattle are avoiding the low ground by the creek, which means either the water quality's off or something's driven them away from it. Either way, a 3-week cycle isn't what's needed right now." Miss Ashcroft never had complaints about the south pasture. Miss Ashcroft wasn't asking the right questions about the south pasture, and neither were you. A pause. "That's not an insult to either of you. It's an observation about what's been missed." Cleaver's jaw worked. "You've been here 3 weeks." "Yes." Colton looked at him. "And I've walked that pasture 4 times, and I'm telling you what I see. If you think I'm wrong, tell me why, and if you can make the case, I'll listen. But we've always done it this way isn't a reason." There was a long silence. Vivian held her breath. "Fine," Cleaver finally said. "Not conceding, exactly, but not fighting either. We'll run it your way." "Thank you." Colton turned back toward the cattle without ceremony, and that was the end of it. Vivian went back to the house and wrote Holt Brannigan a letter thanking him for the reference. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that Magnus Granger had gotten wind of the new foreman at Ashcroft Ranch before the end of October, and that what had amused him initially, the newspaper advertisement and its peculiar clause, had transformed into something considerably less amusing when he started hearing reports about what Colton Hayes was actually accomplishing. Magnus Granger was 51 years old, and he had spent roughly 20 of those years building an empire of land and cattle that stretched across 4 counties in Wyoming Territory. He was not, technically speaking, a dishonest man in most of the ways that word applied. He paid his debts. He honored written contracts. He did not, as a rule, steal in ways that were legally demonstrable. He did, however, believe very firmly that what he wanted, he was entitled to, and that the gap between entitlement and possession was primarily a logistics problem. He had wanted Ashcroft Ranch for 7 years. The land adjoined his northern grazing territory and sat on the single most reliable water source in the eastern part of the county, a wide creek fed by snowmelt that ran strong even in drought years. With that water, he could run nearly double the current cattle on his existing land. Without it, he was dependent on a system of stock ponds that dried to mud in bad summers and froze solid in bad winters. He had offered to buy the ranch when Vivian's father was ill, and the old man had declined, which Magnus had understood. Sentiment was sentiment, and the man wanted his daughter to inherit something. He had offered again after the funeral, and Vivian had declined, which he had found mildly irritating but manageable. He had offered a third time, with a considerably larger number on the document he'd dropped on her desk, and she had told him to get out of her office. That had been 3 months ago. He had been patient. He was good at patient when patience served a purpose. He had watched from a distance as the ranch struggled through turnover and internal theft, waiting for the pressure to build to the point where Vivian would reconsider. She was a smart woman, he had always acknowledged that, but she was a single woman running a cattle operation that was genuinely too large for one person to manage without reliable help, and reliable help had been hard to come by. And then Colton Hayes had answered the advertisement. Magnus had heard about the advertisement. Everybody had heard about the advertisement. He'd laughed at it, along with everyone else, because it was, objectively, something to laugh at. A husband clause in a job notice. It was the kind of thing that happened when a woman got desperate and tried to dress desperation up as pragmatism. But the reports coming back from people who'd been out near Ashcroft land were not reports about a desperate ranch. The fencing was getting repaired. The cattle herd's condition was improving. There were rumors that someone had gone through the payroll records and identified the theft that had been quietly bleeding the operation for years. The crew, which had been demoralized and inconsistent, was apparently pulling together in ways that hadn't been seen out there since before the old man died. Magnus sat with these reports for about a week, and then called in a man named Dwight Pell, who served as his general operative in matters he preferred not to have connected to his name. "Tell me what you know about the new man at Ashcroft," he said. Dwight Pell knew quite a bit, as it turned out. He knew that Colton Hayes had a solid reputation across 3 previous employers, that he had no land and no family money, that he lived simply and spent carefully. He knew that Hayes had never had any serious legal trouble and had, in fact, once testified in a cattle theft trial that resulted in the conviction of a man he'd worked alongside for 2 years, which Pell reported as evidence of Hayes's character, but which Magnus heard as evidence of a man who would put principle above personal loyalty. That was, Magnus reflected, the most inconvenient kind of man to have positioned close to something you wanted. "He's honest," Pell concluded. "So everyone says." Magnus drummed his fingers on the desk. "Find out if there are cracks." "In Hayes?" "In any of it. The crew, the finances, the reputation." He paused. "A man like that, with nothing to his name, working a job on someone else's land, there are cracks. There always are." Pell went looking. He found some things that were useful and some things that were not. What was useful Three of Ashcroft Ranch's hands were men who had previously worked for a Granger-adjacent operation, who had opinions about their current employment that were influenced by how that employment compared to what they'd had before. Two of them were unhappy about changes Colton had made to the work rotation. One of them, a young man named Ferris, was unhappy about considerably more than that. He had been supplementing his wages in ways that the old foreman had apparently been willing to overlook, and the new foreman was not. What was not useful? Everything else. Hayes's references held up completely under scrutiny. His conduct on the property was, by every account Pell could gather, exactly what it appeared to be. And the ranch, irritatingly, was visibly improving. There are a few men in the crew who might be persuaded to be cooperative, Pell reported. Magnus nodded. Keep them close. Don't do anything yet. He paused. Let's see how the season plays out. What Magnus was doing, Vivian didn't know yet. She was too busy. The water quality issue in the south pasture turned out to be a dead animal, a deer, judging by what was left, caught in the upstream section of the creek and decomposing in a pool that fed the cattle's lower water access. Colton found it on a Friday afternoon, relocated the access point, treated the affected area, and had it sorted before sunset. He mentioned it at the weekly management meeting, just Vivian and him, a practice they'd fallen into naturally by the third week, as one item among several. You found it on Friday, Vivian said. Yes. And it's handled. Yes. She looked at the list of items he'd brought to the meeting. There were 9 of them, with proposed solutions already noted beside each one. The old foreman used to bring her problems and wait for her to generate the solutions. She had not realized until this contrast how much energy that had been consuming. Cleaver's actually performing better since you arrived, she said. It came out more tentative than she intended. He wants to be useful, Colton said. He didn't think the last 3 foremen were worth impressing, so he didn't bother. He's decided to wait and see on me, which is fair. You knew that? Pretty quickly. He looked at his list. He'll be fine. He's a good hand under the arrogance. Vivian was quiet for a moment. You said that like you actually like him. Colton thought about it. I don't dislike him. He's got more in him than he's been showing. That's usually fixable. She looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, his face was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that came from real work rather than performance. And there was something in the straightforwardness of him that she kept running into, unexpected, like furniture in a dark room. Not unpleasant, just there, taking up actual space. I want to go over the south pasture rotation with you tomorrow, she said, bringing herself back to the list. And the Harlan County auction is in 3 weeks. I've been thinking about which stock to bring and which to sell. I've been thinking about that too. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. I wrote some of it out. She took the paper and smoothed it on the table. His handwriting, the same clear, unadorned script from his application letter, filled half the page with observations about individual animals, breeding potential, market timing, and what he thought the current price trends meant for the decision. She read it twice. This is thorough, she said. I had thoughts. You have a lot of thoughts. He looked at her. Is that a problem? No? She set the paper down. It's a change. They sat with that for a moment, the specific quiet of 2 people who are beginning to trust each other but haven't said so yet, because saying it would require admitting that the trust is building, and both of them were cautious people who had been burned by trusting too quickly. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window in its frame with the particular persistence of a Wyoming night that had decided autumn was over and winter was beginning whether the calendar agreed or not. The northwest fence line, Colton said, returning to his list. The northwest fence line, Vivian agreed. And they went back to work. What neither of them saw, because neither of them had reason to be watching, was the figure at the edge of the north tree line who had been there for the better part of an hour, in the growing dark, watching the light in the office window, and who turned eventually and rode back toward the Granger property at a quiet walk. Pell, writing things down, waiting for instructions. The cracks, as far as he could see, hadn't appeared yet. But Magnus was a patient man, and Winter, as everyone in Wyoming knew, had a way of finding whatever wasn't solid. It always did. The northwest fence line took 4 days to repair properly. Colton had walked it himself first, all 3 miles of it, in the cold, before he put a crew on it, because he'd learned over the years that sending men to fix something you haven't personally assessed was how you ended up with work done twice. What he found was worse than the initial report suggested. Not just broken posts and sagging wire, but evidence that sections of it had been deliberately cut and then loosely rejoined to look intact from a distance. Someone had taken wire cutters to at least 4 separate points, and then twisted the ends back together well enough to pass a casual inspection, but not well enough to hold under any real pressure. He stood at the 3rd such point in the late afternoon, the light going flat and gray the way it did in November in Wyoming, and looked at the clean diagonal cut on the wire end in his hand. Wire didn't cut itself like that. It didn't fray or snap clean. It was cut. He brought it to Vivian that evening without dramatizing it. "Someone's been cutting fence," he said, and set the wire segment on her desk. She looked at it. She didn't say anything for a moment. "When?" she said. "Hard to say exactly. The cuts could be weeks old. They were made to look like natural breaks." He sat down across from her. "We found 4 separate spots on the northwest line, all cut the same way. One of them had cattle tracks through it, which means we've had animals drifting and we didn't know it." Vivian picked up the wire, turned it in her hands. The cut end was clean. She'd grown up on this ranch. She knew what a natural wire break looked like. "Do you know who?" she said. "Not yet." "Guess." Colton looked at her steadily. "I'd rather have more than a guess before I say a name." She set the wire down. "Fine. What do you need?" "A few days. I want to talk to the crew quietly and see what surfaces. And I want to do a full perimeter check before we fix anything else. I want to know if the northwest line is the only place or if there are others." There were others. The full perimeter check took Colton and 2 men he trusted, an older hand named Walt Greer and a young one called Darnell, who had the useful quality of noticing things without commenting on them loudly. 4 days of careful riding. They found 2 more sections on the east boundary and 1 on the south, near the creek access. 7 deliberate cuts in total, spread across the property in a pattern that was not random. Someone had been systematic about it. That was what bothered Colton most. Not the damage was repairable, but the patience behind it. Someone had walked these fence lines and planned the cuts and spread them out enough to avoid easy discovery. That was not the work of a disgruntled hand letting off steam. That was a campaign. He reported this to Vivian on the 5th morning, and the expression on her face when he finished was the controlled, careful expression of a woman who had long practice at not showing things she couldn't afford to show. "Magnus," she said. "It wasn't really a question. I still don't have proof." "No." She stood up from the desk and walked to the window. The yard below was quiet in the early morning, frost still on the ground, 2 of the hands moving between the barns at the start of the day's work. "But you're thinking the same thing I am." "I think someone with resources decided to move against this ranch in a way that built slowly," Colton said. "The payroll theft under Aldrich could have been independent. Aldrich seems like a man who would have done that on his own. But these fence cuts are coordinated. This is someone who wanted the cattle drifting, wanted the perimeter compromised, and wanted it to look like neglect rather than sabotage." Vivian turned from the window. "He made me an offer 3 months ago. Low number. I told him to leave." "How low?" She told him the number. Colton was quiet for a moment. "That's roughly half the value." "Yes." "And when you declined?" He laughed. She came back to the desk. He actually laughed, like he found it charming that I didn't accept. She sat down. "I've known Magnus Granger my whole life. He was friendly to my father, and he has always been absolutely certain that this ranch would end up in his hands eventually." She paused. "He believes that because he's never encountered something he wanted that he didn't eventually get." "He hasn't met the problem of not having the water," Colton said. "The creek. If this ranch's grazing management is what I think it can be, the creek access is worth considerably more than whatever number he put on that document. He knows that. He wants the land at a price that benefits him, which means he needs the land at a disadvantage when he makes the offer." He looked at her. Making the land look mismanaged achieves that. So he cuts fences and lets cattle drift, and the story becomes that Ashcroft Ranch is falling apart without a man at the helm. Her voice was level, but there was something under it. Something like that. She looked at her hands for a moment, flat on the desk. Then she looked at him. What do we do? Fix the fences and document everything we find, Colton said. Every cut, every location. Photographs if we can arrange them. We don't tip our hand yet. He paused. And I want to talk to Ferris. The name landed between them with a specific weight. Ferris was the young hand who had been supplementing his wages under the previous foreman's arrangement, the one Colton had quietly confronted in the second week and whose practice he'd shut down without fanfare or formal accusation. He hadn't fired Ferris. The kid was 22 and had not, as far as Colton could determine, been the architect of the arrangement so much as an opportunistic participant in it. He'd given him a choice. The practice stopped, the past stayed in the past, and Ferris performed his work. So far, Ferris had held to it. But a man who'd already bent once was a man someone else might try to bend again. You think he's been contacted, Vivian said. I think he's a natural target. Young, needs money, already has a history of bending the rules when offered the chance. Colton stood up. I don't think he's done anything yet, but I want to talk to him before someone else does. He found Ferris at the south barn after the morning work, putting away a set of tools with the slightly over-deliberate care of a man who knew he was about to be talked to and was performing normalcy. I need a minute, Colton said. Ferris put the last tool on its hook. Yes, sir. Walk with me. They went out behind the barn, away from the other hands, into the cold. Colton didn't preamble. Has anyone approached you in the last few weeks? Someone from outside the ranch, asking about the operation here? About me? About Miss Ashcroft? About how things are running? Ferris's jaw tightened. He looked at the ground. Maybe. Maybe isn't an answer, Ferris. The kid exhaled. Couple weeks ago. Man, I didn't know. Came up to me in town when I was picking up supplies, bought me a beer, asked questions. Said he was an investor interested in the cattle business in this area. He paused. I didn't tell him much. I don't know much. What did you tell him? That the new foreman was making changes, that some of the crew wasn't happy about it. He looked up, met Colton's eyes briefly, then looked away. That's it. I didn't take any money from him. I know. Colton had already decided this was true, partly from the way Ferris had said it, and partly from the way Ferris was standing, ashamed of the conversation, not of anything more serious. Did he offer any? He suggested there might be opportunities to make some extra income. I told him I wasn't interested. A pause. I didn't tell him anything about the fencing or anything like that. I didn't know about any of that then. What did he look like? Ferris described a heavy-set man, middle-aged, plain clothing, the kind of person who was specifically unremarkable. Colton recognized the description of someone who was trying not to be recognized. If he contacts you again, Colton said, you tell me immediately. You don't agree to anything. You don't tell him you're going to tell me. You just come find me. Yes, sir. Ferris hesitated. Am I in trouble? Not for me. Colton looked at him. But you should understand that whoever that man was working for is not interested in your well-being. He's interested in what you can give him. You need to know the difference. Ferris was quiet. Then, you knew about the thing with the money last fall before you said anything to me. Yes. How long did you know? About 4 days. And you didn't fire me? No. Ferris looked at him. Why not? Colton considered the question. Because the previous arrangement put you in a position you shouldn't have been in, and because you stopped when I said stop, which told me something. He paused. Don't make me wrong about that. The kid nodded and went back to the barn without another word. November deepened and the cold became serious. There is a quality to Wyoming winters that people who haven't experienced them sometimes fail to understand from description alone. It isn't merely cold in the way that other cold is cold. It has weight and intention. It presses. The wind comes off the mountain faces at angles that seem to find every gap in every structure. And the work of keeping a cattle operation running through it is not efficient or clean or straightforward. It is an accumulation of small decisions made in bad conditions, all day, every day, until spring, with no margin for the decisions that go wrong. Colton had wintered in Wyoming before. He knew the math of it. He started adjusting feed management in early November and had the winter hay inventory fully audited by the middle of the month, which revealed a shortfall that the previous management's records hadn't reflected accurately. He brought this to Vivian without apology, because it wasn't his fault, and she needed the accurate number, not the comfortable one. Aldrich's records show 1,400 bales, he said. We have approximately 1,100 in the barn, and another 200 and something in the north cache. That's a shortfall of close to 300 bales going into a serious winter. Vivian looked at the numbers. How serious a winter? The Farmer's Almanac says bad. Walt Greer, who's been here 20 years and trusts his knee more than any almanac, says bad. He paused. I'd plan for bad. Can we source the additional hay? I've already made some calls. There's a rancher east of Rawlins named Sutton with surplus he's willing to sell at fair price. The problem is transport. The roads through the Eastern Pass will be unreliable by December. How much time do we have? 2 weeks, maybe 3, before I wouldn't want to run wagons through that pass. Vivian made the decision in about 30 seconds. Make the deal with Sutton. Get the hay moved. It'll be expensive. Not as expensive as losing cattle in February. She looked at him. You knew what you wanted to do before you came in here. I wanted your sign-off. You have it. She picked up her pen. Anything else? The Harlan County auction is the day after tomorrow. I've been thinking we should hold back the Engel breeding stock rather than sell. Prices are low right now, and that line's worth more than the current market's offering. My father bought those animals specifically for that line. I know, which is why I'd rather carry them through the winter than sell at a 15% discount. He paused. It's your call. It's your recommendation. Yes. She thought about it. We'll hold them. If we come out of winter short on operating funds, I want to revisit it, but for now, hold them. He nodded and stood to go. Colton. He stopped. The Sutton hay. You said you'd already made some calls. Yes. When did you start on that? He thought about it. When I found the inventory discrepancy, 3 days ago. So you were already arranging it before you came to me. He looked at her steadily. I wanted the solution ready when I brought you the problem. That's not the same as acting without your approval. She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said. It isn't. And she went back to her papers. He left without knowing quite what to make of the way she'd said it, which was something that happened to him with increasing frequency and which he had not yet worked out how to categorize. The hay run to Rawlins went without significant incident. Colton took 3 wagons and 4 men, and they were back in 9 days, which was tight but sufficient. The Eastern Pass had been navigable but unpleasant, and by the time they returned the temperature had dropped another 12 degrees, and the sky had the heavy, yellowish look that meant snow was coming in the next day or two. It came. 14 inches over 2 days, and then a freeze behind it that turned the yard to glass, and the water troughs to solid blocks that had to be broken twice daily with the particular exhausting rhythm of winter ranch work. The cattle in the south pasture had to be moved to the barn enclosures, which required 6 men working in near whiteout conditions on the second day of the storm, following animals that did not want to be moved and expressing their objection vocally and physically. Colton was in it with them. This was something the crew had not expected and had not entirely known how to process. The previous foreman had managed from a certain comfortable distance. They gave instructions from covered spaces and expected the results to appear. Colton put on his heaviest coat and his working gloves and went into the snow with the same men he'd sent into the snow, and when the cattle pushed back, he pushed back, and when the cold got into your bones the way it does at our 4 of outdoor work in 17 degrees, he had it in his bones too. It didn't make things easy. Nothing about it was easy. But it made things different in a way that mattered. Cleaver pulled a heifer out of a drift on the 3rd day of the freeze and came back into the barn with ice in his beard and a look on his face that was something between exhaustion and something that had not quite turned into something else yet. He stamped his boots at the door and looked at Colton, who was checking the condition of a calf that had been moved inside and was not thriving. You want to take a look at the one I pulled out? Cleaver said. Think her leg might be wrong. In a minute, Colton said. Hold her in stall 4. Cleaver went. He didn't wait to see if the instruction was appreciated. He just went. Walt Greer, who had been watching from the corner and who had been on this ranch longer than anyone and had seen more than he generally commented on, looked at Colton over the back of the calf. He didn't do that for the last 3 foremen, Walt said. I know, Colton said, and went to look at the heifer. It was somewhere in the 4th week of November, between the storm and the hard freeze that followed it, that Vivian and Colton fell into the habit of reviewing the day after dinner. It hadn't been planned. The first time it happened was purely practical. She had needed to discuss a billing issue with the Rollins feed supplier, and the only time she'd had was after the evening meal, and he'd come to the house for that purpose, and they'd ended up staying at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about things that were not the billing issue. The second time was similar. By the third time, it was just something they did. The kitchen table was where it happened, not the formal office, not the parlor, the kitchen, which was warmer and less arranged, with the coffee pot always on and the lamp casting the kind of light that made the cold outside seem like something that could be held at a distance. They talked about the ranch mostly, because that was the ostensible purpose. Feed inventory, crew performance, spring planning, which felt premature in November, but which Colton maintained was never premature, the cattle breeding projections, the auction strategy, the question of the North Ridge fencing, which had been neglected for 3 seasons and needed significant work before the grazing rotation could be expanded. But they also talked about other things, gradually and without ceremony, in the way that 2 people begin to talk about other things when they've been in close professional proximity long enough that the professional distance starts to feel artificial. Colton told her about the ranch in Colorado, where he'd worked longest, 8 years, which was the longest he'd stayed anywhere. The family had been good people, and leaving when the son's mismanagement made it unworkable had been genuinely painful. He said this plainly, the way he said most things, without performing the emotion but not disguising it either. Vivian told him about the year her father had gotten sick, the first serious illness. When she'd been 28 and had realized for the first time that the ranch would be hers to run, and not in the distant way she'd always assumed, but possibly soon. She hadn't known whether she could do it. She still wasn't always sure, though she'd stopped saying so out loud because she'd learned that uncertainty from a woman in her position was interpreted as incompetence rather than honesty. Colton listened to that without interrupting, and then he said, "You've kept it running through some genuinely bad years. That's not something that happens by accident. It's also not something that happens without cost," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him across the table. "Do you regret answering the advertisement?" He considered this with the same care he applied to most questions that deserved care. "No," he said. "The work's real, and the terms are clear. That's more than I've had at most places." "The terms include Clause 7, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. The evening had drifted into that kind of honesty, and the sentence arrived before she'd decided to say it. He didn't look away, and he didn't get uncomfortable, which she had learned was characteristic of him. "Yes," he said. "They do." "We're past 30 days." "Yes." She waited. "I think," he said slowly, "that there's a version of this conversation that makes sense to have and a version that doesn't. The version that doesn't is the one where we talk about the clause because the clause exists and 30 days have passed." He paused. "The version that might make sense is the one where we talk about it because something real has developed. And I don't think we're there yet." It was the most honest thing he could have said, and she recognized it as such. "No," she said, "we're not." "But we might be," he said. Not as a promise, just as an observation. The way he observed that the south pasture needed rotation adjustment or the northwest fence was failing, a thing he'd noticed and was naming. She nodded slowly. "We might be." They went back to the North Ridge fencing problem after that, and it wasn't awkward, which was its own kind of answer. What was happening at the Granger property during these weeks was different in character. Pell had come back from his investigation with what he considered useful intelligence and what Magnus considered an inadequate return on his patience. Yes, Hayes was performing well. Yes, the crew was improving. Yes, the ranch's operational efficiency had measurably increased since the new foreman's arrival. This was not the information Magnus had been hoping for. What about the fence damage? Magnus asked. Found and documented, Pell said. Hayes had the whole perimeter checked and the cuts logged. He's smart. Magnus was quiet. The hand we approached, Ferris, didn't bite, Pell continued. He talked to Hayes about the contact. He told Hayes. Seems like it. Magnus got up from his desk and walked to the window, which looked north toward the distant line of his property's far boundary, beyond which, though not visible from here, the Ashcroft land began. He had been patient for 7 years. He had watched a struggling operation and waited for it to collapse under its own weight. And then one man had answered a peculiar advertisement, and the calculation had changed. He turned around. I want to move faster, he said. The bank. Pell straightened slightly. The financing on the livestock contracts? She has 3 large purchase contracts outstanding. The Engel stock she's holding, the spring contracts she signed in October. All 3 are financed through the First Territorial Lending Office. Magnus's expression was flat and very deliberate. I have relationships at First Territorial. That's a significant step, Pell said carefully. She said no 3 times. Magnus sat back down. She's not going to say yes with the ranch performing well. She needs to be in a position where saying yes is the only rational choice. He looked at Pell. I want those credit lines reviewed. I want questions raised about the operation's stability. If the financing gets called in or frozen, she'll need operating capital she doesn't have. And then you offer to purchase. At a number that solves her immediate problem. He paused. She'll be grateful eventually. She's a practical woman. Pell nodded. He didn't say what he thought about the plan, because his job was not to have opinions about the plan. What Magnus had not calculated, what he consistently failed to calculate because it was the type of variable his particular thinking didn't naturally account for, was what happened when a woman who had been building a wall of practical competence around herself for years was given a reason to trust someone enough to fight back. He was still thinking of Vivian Ashcroft as a person under pressure. He hadn't noticed that she was becoming something else. The letter from First Territorial arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Vivian in the formal language of institutional concern. Given the recent changes in management and the questions raised about operational stability, the lending office was requesting a review of the outstanding credit facilities, pending which the credit lines would be temporarily suspended, pending verification. Vivian read it twice at the kitchen table on Wednesday morning before Colton arrived. When he came in, she was still holding it. She handed it to him without preamble. He read it. How much is outstanding? He said. She told him. He looked at the letter again. This was coordinated. The language about questions raised about operational stability. Someone raised those questions. The bank didn't arrive at this independently. I know. Magnus. Almost certainly. She folded her hands on the table. Her voice was steady. If the credit line is frozen, I can't honor the spring contracts. If I can't honor the spring contracts, I lose the deposits and potentially face breach penalties. That would clear out most of my operating reserve. She paused. At which point he makes another offer. Colton set the letter on the table between them. What do you want to do? I want to fight it. She looked at him. But I need to know what we actually have. Because if he's going to attack our credibility to the bank, I need our books to be absolutely clean and our operation to be demonstrably healthy. No gaps he can point to. The books are clean, Colton said. I've been over them. How clean? Clean enough that anyone reviewing them would see a ranch that's improved significantly in the last 6 weeks and is on track for a profitable winter. He paused. The fence damage documentation might actually help. It shows that the management issues weren't operational failure. They were deliberate sabotage, which is a different thing. She looked at him. You documented them specifically. I documented them because it seemed like the right thing to do. He was quiet for a moment. But yes, it might be useful. She sat with that. Then, we need to meet with the bank directly. Not write a letter. Meet. In person. I want to bring the operational records and I want to bring the fence documentation and I want to sit across from whoever signed this letter and show them what is actually happening on this property. When? As soon as we can arrange it. Colton nodded. He reached for the letter and looked at the signatory. Dawson. Do you know him? I know of him. He replaced the previous lending manager about a year ago. She paused. I've heard he's ambitious, interested in relationships with larger operations. Magnus has a larger operation. Magnus has the largest operation in 4 counties. She stood up, which is why we need to make sure Mr. Dawson understands that Ashcroft Ranch is not on the way out. It's on the way up. She began gathering the files she'd need, pulling them from the cabinet with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for something to be worth fighting for this directly. Colton watched her for a moment. There was something in the way she moved, not graceful particularly, but purposeful, a kind of forward momentum that had nothing in it that asked for permission, that he found he couldn't easily look away from. He pulled his attention back to the letter. I'll have the complete operational report ready by Friday, he said, including the headcount increase, the pasture management data, and the winter preparation assessment. Include the Rollins hay run numbers, she said without looking up. The proactive inventory management is exactly the kind of thing we want in front of them. Already on the list, she paused in what she was doing and looked at him over the cabinet door. You're good at this? He didn't answer immediately. Good at what? Knowing what the problem actually is. She went back to the files. Most people see the surface problem. You look for the structure under it. He didn't know what to say to that exactly, so he said, Friday, full report. Friday, she agreed. Outside, the wind had dropped from the previous night's volume, but the cold was no less serious, sitting on the land with the flattened tension of something that had settled in for the duration. Somewhere on the north boundary, the repaired fence lines held. The cattle in the south enclosure moved in the particular slow patterns of animals conserving warmth. And in a banker's office in Laramie, a man named Dawson sat at his desk with a note from Magnus Granger's operative that described Ashcroft Ranch as a struggling operation in need of rescue. He hadn't yet met Vivian Ashcroft. He hadn't yet seen the numbers, and he had not yet had to sit across a table from Colton Hayes. That was coming. The meeting with Dawson was set for the second Friday of December, which gave them 8 days. Colton used all 8. He pulled every operational record from the past 6 weeks and organized them in a format that told a clear story: where the ranch had been when he arrived, what had been found, what had been changed, and what the numbers looked like now. He wasn't trying to make the ranch look better than it was. He was trying to make sure it looked exactly as good as it actually was, which was considerably better than whatever picture Dawson had been given by Magnus Granger's people. The fence documentation he presented as a separate section with dates, locations, and the specific nature of each cut. He had Walt Greer and Darnell both write brief statements confirming what they'd observed. He included the dead animal at the creek as well, with the timeline of discovery and remediation. Individually, none of it was dramatic. Together it made a pattern visible. A pattern of deliberate interference with the ranch's operations that predated his arrival and continued in the early weeks of his employment. Vivian reviewed the full package on Thursday evening. She read it slowly, the way she read things that mattered, going back twice to sections she wanted to sit with. You're presenting this to show the bank that the instability wasn't internal, she said. The instability that existed was being created externally and allowed to continue by internal theft. Both of those conditions have been addressed. He paused. The question Dawson needs to answer is whether he's looking at a ranch in decline or a ranch that was being attacked. The numbers make the case that it's the second one. She turned a page. The profit projection for spring is more optimistic than what I'd have put on paper. It's based on the Engel stock breeding projection and the current market trend for that line. It could be wrong. I noted the assumptions. He looked at her. If you want me to pull it back, I will. No. She turned another page. I want it in there. With the assumptions noted, it's honest, and it shows we're thinking forward. She closed the folder. Outside, the temperature had dropped into the single digits and the wind was absent, which in Wyoming in December meant the cold was the serious, settled kind rather than the dramatic kind. More dangerous in its way for being quiet. There's something I want to ask you, she said. He waited. If this goes badly, if Dawson won't move, if Magnus gets what he wants from the bank, what does that actually mean for the operation? He answered her honestly because she had asked him to be honest, and because the alternative would have been an insult to everything they'd built in the past 6 weeks. It means a cash crisis in late winter. You'd have to liquidate some assets, probably cattle, at a bad time in the market cycle to cover the operating gap. You'd come out of it smaller than you went in. And Magnus makes another offer. Probably at a number that looks attractive when you're in the middle of a cash crisis. She nodded slowly. She was looking at the folder, not at him. My father borrowed against this land once, when I was 12. Bad drought year. He paid it back in 18 months, and he never borrowed against it again. She paused. He used to say that a man who gets you in debt owns a piece of your thinking, whether you know it or not. He was right about that. I've been very careful. She looked up. I don't want to lose what he built because someone with more money decided he wanted it. Then we go to Laramie tomorrow, and we make the case. Colton stood, picked up the folder. Dawson's ambitious. Ambitious men want to be on the right side of things. We make sure he understands what the right side is. The ride to Laramie the next morning was 4 hours in weather that could not make up its mind between gray and worse. The road hard with frost and the horses working steadily with the particular focused quality animals develop in serious cold. Vivian rode rather than taking the carriage, which Colton had half expected. She was not a woman who chose comfort over function when function mattered. They didn't talk much on the road, not because there was nothing to say, but because there are kinds of preparation that happen in silence, and both of them understood that. The First Territorial Lending Office was on the main street of Laramie, between a hardware concern and a land title office, which Colton noted without commenting on. Dawson met them in a room that was professionally arranged to suggest authority without quite achieving warmth. A heavy desk, 2 chairs positioned slightly lower than the desk chair, a painting of mountains that was probably expensive and definitely generic. Dawson was younger than Colton had expected, mid-40s maybe, with the careful grooming of a man who was aware that his appearance was part of his professional presentation. He shook Vivian's hand with the practiced courtesy of someone who had learned to treat women in business with surface respect while holding a private opinion about the arrangement. Colton saw it in the slight adjustment of Dawson's posture when he registered that she was the primary party. He shook Colton's hand second. Mr. Hayes, I understand you're the new ranch manager. Foreman, Colton said. Miss Ashcroft manages the ranch. A small adjustment in Dawson's expression. Of course. They sat. Vivian put the folder on the desk. I want to understand the basis for the credit review notice, she said. She was direct without being aggressive, and she'd told Colton beforehand that she was going to let the records do most of the talking because numbers were harder to dismiss than personality. The letter referenced questions about operational stability. I'd like to know what those questions were specifically, so I can address them specifically. Dawson had prepared for this. He had a folder of his own. He spoke about industry trends, about the challenges of large cattle operations in the current economic climate, about concerns that had been raised by, he was careful here, parties familiar with the regional market. What parties? Vivian asked. I'm not in a position to identify sources of... Mr. Dawson. Her voice was level. This bank has held financing for Ashcroft Ranch for 11 years. In that time, every loan has been repaid on schedule. The credit rating of this operation has been consistently strong. Now you've received concerns from unnamed parties and suspended a credit facility without speaking to me first. She paused. I'd like to understand what weight those unnamed concerns carry relative to 11 years of documented history. Dawson's composure was professional, but it shifted slightly. He hadn't expected this particular framing. Colton set his section of the folder on the desk. I've prepared a full operational assessment for the past 7 weeks. I'd ask you to look at it before we continue. Dawson looked at it. He was quiet for several minutes. Colton had organized it well. Not aggressively, not as an argument, but as information, presented clearly enough that the information made its own argument. The head count, the feed management, the fence documentation, the winter preparation, the profit trajectory. The fence cuts, Dawson said slowly, looking at that section. 7 separate instances of deliberate fence cutting across 4 sections of the perimeter, Colton said. Documented with dates, locations, and photographs. I've included signed statements from 2 crew members who participated in the investigation. He paused. This is what the operational challenges at Ashcroft Ranch actually look like. Not mismanagement, deliberate sabotage. Dawson looked at the statements. He looked at the photographs. He looked at the timeline. Who? He started. We don't have legally actionable proof of who directed it, Vivian said. What we have is documentation that the challenges to this ranch's operations were being created externally, and that since those issues were identified and addressed, the operation has improved significantly. She gestured to the profit projection. That's where we're going. That's what you're choosing to support or not support. There was a long pause. Dawson closed the folder. He opened it again. He looked at the profit projection, then at the fence documentation, then at the 11 years of repayment history that Vivian had appended to the front. I'll need to review this with my colleagues, he said, and I'll need a few days. Of course. Vivian stood, which ended the meeting on her terms. I'd ask that the credit suspension be lifted on a provisional basis while the review happens. The spring contracts have timing considerations that can't wait indefinitely. Dawson hesitated. I can authorize a partial restoration of the credit facility pending the full review. That will do for now. She picked up her folder. Thank you for your time, Mr. Dawson. In the street afterward, the cold came back at them with the full force of a Wyoming December noon, which was not much warmer than a Wyoming December dawn. They walked to where the horses were tied without speaking for half a block. Then Vivian said, He's going to call Magnus. Probably tonight, Colton agreed. And Magnus is going to tell him whatever he can to counteract what we showed him. Yes, he untied his horse. But we showed him first. And what we showed him was real. She untied hers. For a moment they stood on either side of the horses in the cold street, and she looked at him over the back of her mare with an expression he hadn't quite seen from her before. Not relief exactly, but something that was the beginning of something larger than relief. Thank you, she said. Not formally, just as a fact. We did it together, he said, which was also just a fact. She nodded once and mounted, and they turned toward home. What happened in the following 10 days was a pressure campaign of a different order than what Magnus had tried before. He had underestimated the meeting with Dawson. He'd expected Vivian to come in defensive and emotional, and for Dawson to find her easy to manage. Instead, Dawson had called him that evening, sounding not alarmed exactly, but careful, the kind of careful that meant his calculation of the situation had shifted, and he'd asked Magnus some questions about the fence documentation that Magnus had not been prepared to answer. She has photographs, Dawson said. Of fences, Magnus said. Fences deteriorate. The photographs include close-ups of the cut ends. The bank's attorney would want to look at those before we proceed with any action that could be characterized as, I understand, Magnus said. Let me think about how to proceed. He thought about it for 2 days, and then he made a decision that represented a different kind of move. He stopped going after the bank and started going after the reputation. He was a man with significant social standing in Laramie and across the territory, and social standing, carefully applied, was a lever of its own kind. He had dinner with 2 men who were prominent in the Territorial Cattlemen's Association, and he talked carefully about his concerns for Ashcroft Ranch. He expressed admiration for Vivian. He was always careful to express admiration for Vivian, but suggested that a woman of her position, managing alone after her father's death, had perhaps made some decisions in her loneliness that a more dispassionate advisor might have counseled against. The advertisement with Clause 7 was, he implied, a symptom of something. A woman who would put a marriage clause in a job notice was a woman under strain, perhaps making choices from vulnerability rather than strength. And the man who had answered that advertisement, well, no one who was doing well in his own right answered an advertisement like that. It was elegant in its way. Nothing specific enough to be refuted, nothing direct enough to be confronted, just the particular social poison of a powerful man sharing his concerns with other powerful men over good food and decent whiskey. By the middle of December, Vivian began hearing it in small ways. An invitation to a Ranchers Association dinner that didn't arrive. A supplier who was suddenly uncertain about extending the usual credit terms. A woman she'd known since childhood, who was warm on the street but whose eyes carried something new and slightly pitying. She didn't say anything to Colton about the social dimension at first. She wasn't sure why, partly because it was harder to document and fight than a credit suspension, and partly because she had discovered, without quite knowing when it had happened, that she didn't want to burden him with things she couldn't solve. He figured it out anyway. He figured it out because he paid attention to things, which was both his greatest professional asset and occasionally uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of. He'd noticed the supplier situation. He handled most of the supply relationships, and he'd made inquiries carefully, and what came back was not information about their creditworthiness, but a vague unease in the answers he got that had social rather than financial origins. He brought it to her on a Wednesday evening at the kitchen table. "Someone's been talking," he said. "Not to the bank this time, to people." She looked at her coffee. "I know. You knew." "I suspected." She set the cup down. "There was a dinner for the Cattlemen's Association. I've attended for 6 years. This year my invitation didn't come." He was quiet. "It's Magnus," she said. "He can't get to the bank directly anymore. Dawson's being careful now, so he's going after the other thing." She paused. "The reputation. Yours specifically, or the ranch's?" "Mine. The advertisement." She said it flatly. Clause 7. A lonely woman making desperate choices. That's the story he's telling. She looked at Colton. "And you, by association. A man with nothing to his name who answered a notice with a marriage clause. The implication writes itself." Colton's jaw was set in a way she'd learned meant he was angry about something and was choosing what to do with it carefully. "What do you want to do?" "I've been thinking about that." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I want to be visible. I want to show up to everything I'm still invited to, bring the operation numbers, be completely normal and competent and undramatic." She paused. "And I want to invite people to the ranch. The association members who haven't entirely been turned, the neighboring ranchers, the feed suppliers. I want them to see what's actually happening here, not what Magnus is describing." A kind of counter-argument. A demonstration. She looked at him. "People believe what they see more than what they hear. If they can see the operation, see the crew, see the books, see us working together normally without anything peculiar about it," Colton finished. "Yes." She met his eyes. Do you object to being part of that?" He thought about it. "No, it's honest." He paused. "But I want to be clear that I'm not going to perform something that isn't real for the benefit of people who are trying to judge us." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if people come here and see how we work together, they're going to see us working together, not a performance of it." He looked at her directly. "What's actually here is already better than anything we could manufacture. I just think we should agree that's what we're putting forward." Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, but it shifted. "What's actually here?" she repeated quietly. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then that's what we put forward." The visit from the neighboring ranchers happened on a Thursday in the 3rd week of December, when the days were at their shortest and the sky went dark before 5. And the cold was the permanent kind that stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like atmosphere. 4 men came, the Alderson brothers from the west, a man named Pickett from south of the county line, and an older rancher named Hess who had known Vivian's father for 40 years and who had the particular authority of someone whose opinion was trusted across the board. Colton took them through the operation. Not a tour arranged for spectacle, but a working afternoon. They saw the cattle in the enclosures, the hay inventory, the records, the fence repair work, the water management system he'd put in place at the creek. He answered their questions without defensiveness. When Hess asked pointed questions about the payroll discrepancies under the previous management, Colton explained what he'd found and what had been corrected, and he gave Hess the numbers without softening them because Hess was not a man you gave soft numbers to. "You cleaned up someone else's mess," Hess said. It wasn't a question. "I cleaned up what needed cleaning," Colton said. "That's the job." Hess looked at him for a long moment with the kind of look that was doing a lot of measuring in not much time. "Brannigan at Double Creek speaks well of you." He's a fair man. He's a hard man to impress. Hess turned to look at the south cattle enclosure. These animals are in better condition than I expected for this late in the season. We got the winter preparation done early. That helps. Vivian joined them for the late afternoon review, and what the ranchers saw was not a woman performing capability, but a woman who knew exactly what she had, what it was worth, and what she was doing with it. She fielded questions about the spring contracts, the breeding projections, the expansion plans for the North grazing territory. She disagreed with Pickett about market timing in a way that was direct and not apologetic, and that Pickett seemed to find more convincing than if she'd agreed with him. Hess pulled Colton aside before they left, at the edge of the yard where the horses were tied, and the sky was the dark blue of a winter late afternoon. "People have been talking," Hess said. Not unkindly. "I know," Colton said. "Magnus Granger's version of this ranch and what I saw this afternoon are two different things." "Yes?" Hess looked at him steadily. "I'm going to say that at the next association meeting, that I came here and saw what I saw." He paused. "I don't do things for other people's benefit, so don't thank me. I do it because it's accurate and I don't like inaccuracy." He mounted his horse. "You've got something real here, Hayes. Don't lose it." He rode out before Colton had decided how to respond. Christmas came to Ashcroft Ranch the way it came to most working operations in the territory, practically and without excess sentimentality. Vivian had the cook prepare a proper dinner for the whole crew, which was the tradition her father had maintained and which she'd continued even through the harder years. The men ate well and were given the following day off, and most of them appreciated this more than any formal celebration. Colton sat at the crew table rather than at the house table, which raised an eyebrow from Walt Greer, who noted it without commenting. After the meal, when the yard was quiet and most of the hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, Colton came to the house with the weekly report, which was a thin excuse, and both of them knew it. Vivian had a fire going and 2 cups of coffee on the table, and she didn't pretend she hadn't expected him. "Hess's comments at the association meeting," she said. "I heard from Alderson this morning. Apparently it shifted things." "Good. Dawson has confirmed the credit facility is fully restored." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I got the letter yesterday." Colton looked at her. "You didn't mention that." "I'm mentioning it now." A slight curve at the edge of her mouth. "I wanted to tell you in person." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night was absolute and still, the kind of stillness that only happens when the temperature drops below a certain point and the very air seems to stop moving. In the bunkhouse, someone was playing a harmonica badly and with great enthusiasm. "We've been past 30 days for a while," he said. She looked at him over her cup. 7 weeks. "I'm aware." He set his own cup down. "I said before that I didn't think we were at the point where that conversation made sense. That was an honest answer at the time." "And now?" He looked at her carefully, not nervously. He wasn't a nervous man, but with the specific attention of someone who had decided to say a true thing and was choosing the words with appropriate care. "Now, I think we're somewhere else," he said. "I don't know exactly what to call it, but whatever it is, it's real, and I don't think pretending it isn't there is doing either of us any service." Vivian put her cup down. The harmonica in the bunkhouse fumbled through a phrase and recovered badly. "No," she said, "it isn't." They sat with that for a moment, not resolving it. It wasn't the kind of thing that resolved cleanly in a single conversation, and both of them were too careful for that. But acknowledging it, letting it be present in the room without immediately trying to put it somewhere. "I'm not going to say something I don't mean," Vivian said. "And I'm not going to pretend the clause is the reason this is happening, because it isn't. I know that. What I'll say is that what's here," she paused, choosing, "I didn't expect, and I don't want to lose it by moving at the wrong speed." "Neither do I." He looked at her. "So we don't." It was not a romantic declaration. It was an agreement between 2 practical people about something that had become real between them without either of them engineering it, and for that reason, it was more solid than a declaration would have been. "The North Ridge," he said, after a moment. "The North Ridge," she agreed. They went back to the planning, and the harmonica in the bunkhouse finally landed on something that resembled a melody, and outside the Wyoming winter held everything still. What neither of them knew was that Magnus Granger had run out of patience. The social campaign hadn't worked the way he'd intended. Hess's intervention at the association meeting had blunted it considerably. The bank move had been neutralized. His people inside the Ashcroft crew had either come around to the new management or been identified, and Ferris, the one he'd been most hopeful about, had clearly chosen the other side. He was running out of indirect options. He called Pell in on the day after Christmas, and they had a different kind of conversation than the ones they'd had before. Pell, who had spent years working for Magnus and who had his own sense of how far certain things should go, listened to what was being proposed and was quiet for longer than usual. "That's a significant escalation," Pell said finally. "I'm aware. If it goes wrong, it won't go wrong if it's done right." Magnus looked at him. "I need the breeding stock moved. Not sold, not harmed. Moved. Enough of them, far enough, that it takes time to find them, and the spring contracts can't be honored in the meantime." He paused. "By the time she finds them, the contract penalties will have hit, and the operating position will look exactly like what I've been saying it looks like." Pell was quiet again. "I'm paying you well," Magnus said. "You are," Pell agreed. "I'll need men I can trust." "Use the ones from the Eastern operation, not local." Magnus paused. "And do it soon. Weather window is closing." Pell nodded and left. The plan was set. And 700 miles of Wyoming winter lay between Magnus Granger's intentions and the moment Colton Hayes would ride into a blizzard to find out what had been taken. That moment was coming faster than either of them knew. The first sign was a count discrepancy on the morning of December 28th, when the hand doing the early feed run came back to the barn with a number that was wrong by more than rounding error could explain. He reported it to Colton, who put on his coat and went out immediately, and by the time he'd walked the south enclosure twice and the adjacent holding pen once, the cold working through every layer he had, he knew it was an accounting mistake. He went to Vivian's office with snow on his boots and a number in his head that sat in his chest like a stone. "How many?" she said when she saw his face. "At least 80, he said. "Maybe more. I need to do the full count before I know." She stood up from the desk. Her face was very still. "The Engelstock," he said. "The breeding line." She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them. "Show me." The full count confirmed 93 animals missing, not 80. 93 head of the Engel breeding stock, representing the single most valuable component of Ashcroft Ranch's long-term operation, gone from the south enclosure sometime in the night, while the temperature dropped and the wind stayed down, and whoever had done it had apparently counted on exactly that: the stillness, the dark, the cold that kept people inside and made sound carry strangely. Colton walked the enclosure fence with Vivian and Walt Greer in the early morning light, and what they found was not subtle. 3 sections of the enclosure fence had been cut, not the perimeter fence this time, but the interior holding pens, close to the gate that faced the northwest access road. The cuts were the same clean diagonal he'd seen on the perimeter fence in October. Same tool, possibly the same hands. They knew the layout, Walt said. He was looking at the gate mechanism, which had been opened and then closed again, not locked. "Someone's been on this property before." "Yes," Colton said. Vivian was crouched at the fence cut. Looking at the wire. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Tracks?" "Northwest Road," Colton said. "They took them out that way. The ground's frozen hard enough that we won't get much detail, but the direction is clear." She stood up. Her face had the set look he'd come to recognize. Not cold exactly, but contained, all of her internal processing happening somewhere that didn't show on the surface. "How long ago?" "Walt thinks the cut was made between 2 and 4 this morning. The snow that fell yesterday evening had time to settle around the fence before the cut was made, but the cut edges are still clean. No ice accumulation." So 4 to 6 hours, Vivian said. "At most." She turned and looked northwest, past the fence line and the dark tree edge, toward the road that eventually wound through the mountain passes. The sky was pale and very cold, the kind of sky that didn't promise anything good about the weather coming. If they took them northwest, she said, they're heading toward the high pass. Or the Elkhorn Valley beyond it, Colton said. There are holding operations out that way, remote ones. Someone's holding them for Magnus, she said. Not a question. Someone's holding them for whoever paid to have them moved. He paused. We still don't have. I know we don't have proof. Her voice was flat. We also have 93 animals missing and a spring contract we cannot honor without them. She turned to look at him. Can we find them? He had been thinking about this since he'd seen the count. The Northwest Road in late December was not a hospitable route. The high pass was navigable but not comfortable, and moving nearly 100 animals through it in December required planning and would leave a trail even on frozen ground. But the window was not unlimited. If whoever had moved them got the herd far enough into the Elkhorn Valley and dispersed them into existing operations, recovery would become a legal problem rather than a tracking problem, and legal problems took time that the spring contracts didn't have. I think we can, he said. If we move today. Vivian looked at the sky again. There's weather coming. Yes. How bad? Walt says bad. Almanac says bad. He met her eyes. We move fast or we don't move at all. She was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then, who do you want? Cleaver, Darnell, and Ferris. And Walt for the first section of the road. He knows the Northwest Pass better than anyone. She nodded. Take what you need from the supply barn. I'm going to the sheriff. Colton stopped. Kirby's sheriff is... I know what kind of man Kirby is. She was already walking back toward the house. But I need this on record. I need the theft documented officially, today, before anyone starts questioning whether it happened the way we say it happened. She looked back over her shoulder. Go get the men ready. I'll be back before you leave. He went. Telling the crew was not a complicated conversation. Colton laid it out plainly. What was missing, which direction, what the conditions were, what the timeline required, and he watched the men's faces as he talked. Cleaver's jaw tightened. Darnell's expression went very still in the way it went still when he was processing something serious. Ferris, who was the youngest of them, and who had more reason than most to be cautious about anything that put him at risk, looked at Colton and said, When do we leave? An hour, Colton said. Dress for 2 days minimum. If the weather comes in fast, we may not be coming back tonight. What are we looking for when we find them? Cleaver asked. Proof of who moved them. Brands, if they've been altered, they won't have had time to do it properly, so look for fresh marking. Any documentation on whoever's holding them. Names, if we can get them. And if they're not cooperative about giving them back, Cleaver said. Colton looked at him. We're not taking anything by force. We find where they are, we get visual confirmation, we document everything, and we come back with that information. The law handles the rest. Cleaver didn't look entirely satisfied with this answer, but he nodded. Walt came to Colton before they mounted, standing by the barn door in the gray morning with his coat buttoned to the top, and his expression the particular seriousness of an old man who has lived through enough to recognize when something is genuinely dangerous. Weather's going to come in by afternoon, Walt said. Maybe sooner. I know. The high pass in a storm. I know, Walt. The old man looked at him. You find them, you leave someone with them, and you send the rest back before it gets bad. Don't get everyone stuck up there trying to move a herd in a blizzard. That's good advice, Colton said. I know it is. Walt handed him a rolled piece of oilskin. Map of the Elkhorn Valley. There are 3 holding operations out there that someone would use if they wanted remote and quiet. I've marked them. Colton took the map. Thank you. Bring Ferris home in one piece, Walt said. His mother's a decent woman, and she's already had enough trouble. Then he walked away before the moment could turn into something he wasn't comfortable with. Vivian came back from the sheriff's office 40 minutes later with her horse blowing steam and her expression carrying the specific frustration of a person who has dealt with an inadequate institution and gotten exactly what they expected from it. Kirby took the report, she said, swinging down. He was sympathetic in the way that costs nothing and promised to look into it. Meaning he'll do very little, Colton said. Meaning he'll do nothing that inconveniences Magnus Granger. She tied the horse and looked at the 4 men mounted and ready in the yard. The supplies were packed. The horses were good ones. I sent a message to Hess as well. He has connections in the Elkhorn area. If someone's trying to run cattle through there, his people may hear something. That's good thinking. She looked at him. The morning was fully light now, pale and cold, the sky the color of old pewter in the northwest where the weather was building. Be careful, she said. It came out more plainly than she'd intended. She didn't try to walk it back. We'll find them, he said. I know you'll find them. I said, be careful. She held his gaze for a moment. Those are two separate things. He looked at her. Something in his chest did something he didn't immediately have language for. Yes, he said. They are. He mounted and they rode out. The northwest road was hard and clear for the first 2 hours, the horses' hooves ringing on the frozen ground with a sound that was almost musical in the cold stillness. Colton pushed the pace, not recklessly, but with the deliberate efficiency of a man who understood that the weather overhead was not waiting for them to finish. Darnell found the first sign about 6 miles out, a wide disturbance in the thin snow at the road's edge, where a large group of animals had moved off the road briefly and back on. The disturbance was recent enough that the edges were still sharp. They came through here maybe 5 hours ago, Darnell said, crouched over the tracks, moving steady, not rushed. They thought they had time, Cleaver said. They thought no one would notice until morning feeding, Colton said. They got the timing almost right. Almost. The almost was what they were working with. The high pass was a different matter. They reached the lower approach by mid-morning, and the wind had started. Not the calm that had facilitated the theft, but a building northwest wind that had teeth in it and was getting worse. The pass itself was visible ahead, a gap between two ridge faces, and above it the sky had gone the particular dark gray that meant the weather was not coming. It had arrived and was deciding how serious to be. We go up or we don't, Cleaver said. He was not complaining. He was stating the geometry of the situation. Colton looked at the pass, then at the tracks that continued up the approach road, then at the sky. We go up, he said. The pass took an hour that felt longer. The wind came at them from angles that seemed to change purpose every few minutes, and the horses didn't like it. Not panicked, because these were working horses that had been through Wyoming winters, but resistant in the way that animals are resistant when their instinct and their training are in conflict, and their training is winning but without enthusiasm. At the top of the pass, in the brief shelter of the rock face on the east side, Colton pulled out Walt's map. The Elkhorn Valley below them was wide and white, and the cloud cover had dropped low enough that the far ridges were invisible. 3 holding operations marked on the map, one at the valley's north end, one midway along the east face, one in the southern flat where an old ranch structure had changed hands 3 times in 5 years. They'd want something remote but accessible, Darnell said, looking over his shoulder at the map. South Flat, Colton said. The old Hennessy place. It's remote enough to be discreet, but the road's passable. How do you know about the Hennessy place? Ferris asked. Walt marked it and wrote most likely next to it in different ink. Colton folded the map. He'd already done the thinking. They started down the pass. The south flat of the Elkhorn Valley was an hour's ride from the pass bottom, and the snow there was deeper, 8 or 10 inches on the flat ground, undisturbed except for the line of tracks that came down from the pass and turned south exactly as Colton had expected. Fresh tracks. The herd had been moved through here within the last few hours. Cleaver saw the structures first, a main barn, 2 outbuildings, a rough corral that had been extended recently with what looked like new posts visible by the color difference in the wood against the old fence line. Someone set that corral up for a larger group than usual, Cleaver said quietly. Recently, Colton agreed. They pulled up in the tree line about 400 yards from the structures and looked. The cattle were visible in the extended corral. Not all of them. The barn doors were closed and some were probably inside, but enough of them that the angle line's distinctive coloring was identifiable even at distance. There they are, Ferris said. His voice was quiet with the specific feeling of something confirmed. There were 2 men visible outside the main structure, both bundled against the cold, one near the corral and one near the barn door. A third figure moved in the corral itself, checking the animals. 3 that we can see, Darnell said. Could be more inside. Colton thought about Walt's advice on the pass. He looked at the weather. The wind had dropped slightly in the valley floor, which was deceptive because that often meant the storm was organizing rather than relenting. They had maybe 2 hours of reasonable visibility. Here's what we do, he said quietly. Ferris and I go in direct. We don't sneak. We ride up to the front. We identify ourselves. We tell them we're here for the Ashcroft cattle and we want to discuss the situation. He paused. Cleaver, you and Darnell circle to the east side and stay in the tree line. Don't come in unless something goes wrong. What counts as something going wrong? Cleaver asked. You'll know it. Ferris looked at Colton. You sure about riding up direct? We're not doing anything wrong, Colton said. We're not on their property to take anything. We're here to locate stolen animals and identify who has them. Direct is better than sneaking because sneaking suggests we're not sure of our position, and we are. He looked at Ferris. Ready? Yes, sir, Ferris said, and meant it. They rode out of the tree line at a normal pace. The man by the corral saw them first and straightened, and then turned and said something to the man near the barn door. And by the time Colton and Ferris reached the main yard, there were 4 men. The third had come out of somewhere, standing in a loose arrangement that was not technically threatening, but was arranged to look like more than it was. The man who stepped forward was the one from the barn, and he had the look of someone who had been put in charge of this particular situation and was not entirely comfortable with that arrangement. Private property, the man said. I can see that, Colton said. He stayed mounted. He'd learned a long time ago that staying on a horse in a tense conversation gave you a useful difference in perspective, both literal and psychological. I'm Colton Hayes, foreman at Ashcroft Ranch. Those animals in your corral are Ashcroft property. I have the brand documentation here. He held up the folder he'd put in his coat. I'd like to talk about how they came to be here. The man's eyes went to the folder and then back to Colton's face. Don't know what you're talking about. 93 head of Engel breeding stock moved from Ashcroft enclosures in the early hours of this morning. The brand is registered and documented, and I can show you the paperwork or you can look at the animals and see for yourself. He paused. Either way, those cattle are going home. You got a bill of sale for me to look at. They go home, the man said. You don't. They stay until we settle the question properly. There is no bill of sale because they weren't sold. They were stolen. Colton kept his voice even, which means the question has already been settled. This is theft. The sheriff's office in Kirby has a report filed this morning. There's a record of what was taken, when it was taken, and in what direction it left. He looked at the man. You want to be the person holding stolen animals when that record catches up to this location? Something shifted in the man's face. Not guilt exactly. He was not a man who was built for visible guilt, but a calculation. The math of the situation was changing in real time, and he was running the numbers. I was told these were purchased animals, the man said. He said it too quickly, which told Colton something. Who told you that? The man was quiet. I'm not a law officer, Colton said. I'm not here to arrest anyone. I'm here for the cattle. If you help me get them home, that helps establish that you were acting on information you were given rather than on your own initiative. He paused. If you don't, the situation looks considerably different for everyone involved. A long moment. Wind moved through the corral and the cattle shifted. I'll need to make some arrangements, the man said finally. Take the time you need. Colton dismounted and stood in the yard. We're not in a hurry. This was not entirely true given the weather, but it was true in the way that mattered. What followed was 2 hours that were neither clean nor simple. The man, whose name turned out to be Krell, and who was indeed an operative of Magnus's Eastern operation, as Walt had suspected, made his arrangements in the form of a conversation on paper that he wrote out himself and signed, describing who had paid him to hold the cattle and what he'd been told about their provenance. Colton didn't coerce this. He simply sat in the cold yard and waited, and the silence and the waiting and the mathematics of the situation did the work. Krell gave him the paper. Colton read it. Dwight Pell's name was on it, and above Pell's, a reference to the instructions that had come from the Granger Eastern Operations account. Not Magnus's name directly. but close enough. Combined with the fence documentation and the bank interference and everything else, to build a picture that would hold together. "Thank you," Colton said, and folded the paper into his coat alongside the brand documents. Getting 93 cattle back over the high pass in deteriorating weather with 4 men was not a story that resolved neatly. The storm came in properly about halfway up the pass approach, and for an hour, the visibility dropped to the length of a horse, and the wind was the kind that found every gap and made every decision feel like the wrong one. Cleaver and Darnell were on the flanks, Ferris on the tail end, Colton at the lead, and nobody said much because there was nothing to say that the wind wouldn't take anyway. The cattle moved because they had to. Animals in bad weather want to be somewhere else, and somewhere else in this case was down the pass and into the valley, which was the right direction. Colton used that, worked with the instinct rather than against it, kept the pressure gentle from the rear and the sides, let the herd find its own pace within the bounds of what was needed. They came down off the pass as the light was failing, and the weather moderated slightly at the lower elevation, and by the time the first lights of the ranch were visible in the distance, the herd was moving in a solid, tired line that had the particular defeated quality of animals that had had a very long day and wanted it to end. The yard was lit when they came in. Vivian was there, and Walt, and the rest of the hands who had not gone and had clearly been waiting. She came out into the yard as the herd came through the main gate, and she counted without appearing to count, the way she'd always done it, her father's habit that had become hers. And Colton saw her face as the last animal came through. He swung down beside her. 93? She said. 93. She looked at the herd moving into the enclosure, the tired animals settling, the hands moving to guide them. Then she looked at him, at his coat white with ice on the shoulders, at the specific exhaustion of a man who had ridden a mountain pass in a blizzard and come back with what he went for. "You're frozen," she said. "I've been colder. That's not something to be proud of." She took his arm, not with sentiment, but with the practical authority of someone who had decided the next thing that happened was getting him inside, and she steered him toward the house. "Come inside. Walt will finish with the herd." "I should—" "Walt will finish," she said, and her grip on his arm didn't argue. In the kitchen, with the lamp going and the coffee pot already on, he put Krell's written statement and the brand documentation on the table between them. She read both. He watched her face as she read them. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Pell," she said. "Signed statement. Krell confirms Pell directed the operation and that the payment came from the Granger Eastern account." He paused. "It's not a direct line to Magnus, but it's close." "Close enough?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. Close enough to make the legal case difficult for him. Close enough that anyone who already suspects him will have confirmation. Close enough that, he paused, that a man like Magnus, who cares about what people think, will feel it. She looked at the statement again. Then she looked at him. In the lamplight, with the cold still coming off him and the coffee between them and the weight of the day present in the room, she said, "You rode through a blizzard. The cattle needed to come home. You could have come back and sent the law. Kirby's law wouldn't have gone up that pass today, and by tomorrow there wouldn't be evidence. There'd just be a man in the Elkhorn Valley saying he'd bought some cattle and a bill of sale that appeared from somewhere." He met her eyes. "We needed to be there." She looked at him. Something in the way she was looking at him had shifted from the way she'd looked at him before, and they both felt it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "I want to talk to you about the clause," she said. He went still. "Not the way you said we couldn't yet, not because 30 days passed and it's on the table contractually." She put her hands flat on the table between them. "I want to talk about it because I know what I think, and I'd rather say it plainly than wait for a more comfortable moment." She paused. "I've been waiting for comfortable my whole life, and I'm tired of it." He looked at her. "I trust you," she said. "That's not a small thing for me. It's the largest thing I have to give someone. And I've been watching you for 2 months, and I know what you are, and I don't want to manage the distance anymore." She stopped. "That's it. That's what I wanted to say." He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I meant what I told you that first night," he said, "about not being after your land. I know you did. I also meant what I said about something being real here. He looked at her directly. I'm not a man who performs things. What you've been seeing is what there is. I know that too. Then, he said, and stopped, and something crossed his face that was not his usual contained expression, but something underneath it. Then I think we're having the conversation. I think we are, she said. It was not a declaration with music under it. It was two careful people sitting in a kitchen after a very long day, choosing to stop pretending they hadn't already decided something, and that was its own kind of declaration, the kind that holds. What neither of them was thinking about in that moment was Magnus Granger. But Magnus Granger was thinking about them. Pell came to him the next morning with the news of what had happened at the Elkhorn Valley, and Magnus's face did something that Pell had not often seen it do. It went through several expressions rapidly and settled on none of them. He went up there himself, Magnus said, in the blizzard, brought them all back. And Krell gave them a statement. Pell said it flatly because there was no way to say it that helped. He said he was acting on outside instructions, named me, named the account. Magnus was very quiet. He was protecting himself, Pell said. He didn't have strong enough reason to protect us instead. No, Magnus said. He didn't. He walked to the window. Outside, the morning after the blizzard was unnervingly clear, the sky a hard blue, everything white and sharp. Where does that leave us legally? Exposed, Pell said. Not fatally, if the statement is the only thing, but combined with the fence documentation and the bank interference, someone builds a case from all three. It becomes a different matter. Magnus looked out the window for a long time. He's not going to stop, Magnus said finally. It wasn't really about Colton Hayes specifically. It was about the situation, about the thing he'd miscalculated. Neither of them are going to stop. No, sir, Pell agreed. I don't think they are. Magnus turned from the window. His face had settled into the expression of a man who was revising a long-held position about how the world worked and finding the revision unwelcome. I need to talk to my attorney, he said. It was, in its way, the beginning of the end of something. Not the dramatic end that comes all at once, but the kind that starts with a man standing at a window understanding for the first time that what he wanted was not available in any form he'd been trying to take it. Outside, on the road between Laramie and the Ashcroft property, two things were happening simultaneously that Magnus didn't know about yet. Hess was riding toward Laramie with the names of two men who had helped move the cattle and who were willing to provide statements gathered through the network of connections he'd activated when Vivian's message reached him 2 days prior. And Vivian's attorney, a methodical man named Corfield, who had handled the Ashcroft estate since her father's time, was composing a letter to the territorial court describing a pattern of deliberate interference with a private ranch operation, attaching the fence documentation, the banking interference timeline, and the statement from Krell, and requesting a formal inquiry. The walls were coming in. And in the kitchen of the ranch house, Colton Hayes was on his second cup of coffee and his second conversation with a woman he had ridden through a blizzard for, and neither of them was pretending anymore that what they were building was only a ranch. Corfield's letter reached the territorial court on the 3rd day of January. It was not a dramatic document. Corfield was not a dramatic man. He was 70 years old, had practiced law in Wyoming Territory for 40 of them, and had long since learned that the most effective legal arguments were the ones that didn't require the reader to feel anything, only to understand. The letter laid out a sequence of events in plain chronological order. The fence cuts, documented with dates and photographs. The bank interference, documented with the letter from First Territorial, and the timeline of Dawson's contact with Granger-adjacent parties. The cattle theft, documented with Krell's signed statement, the brand records, and the account trail that connected the payment to the Granger Eastern operation. No accusations that couldn't be supported, no emotional language, just the sequence, the documentation, and the request for a formal inquiry into a pattern of interference with private property and commercial operations. Corfield had been doing this long enough to know that the strength of a legal case was not in how loudly it was made, but in how cleanly it held together under examination. This one held together cleanly. He knew it when he wrote it, and he could tell from the speed of the court's response, a formal acknowledgement within 5 days, which was fast for the territorial court, that someone on the receiving end had read it and reached the same conclusion. Vivian got the acknowledgement letter on a Tuesday and read it at the kitchen table with Colton across from her, and she didn't celebrate. She folded it and put it in the file she'd been building since October, alongside the fence photographs and the bank correspondence and Krell's statement and Hess's witness names, and she said, "Now we wait." "How long?" Colton asked. "Corfield thinks 6 to 8 weeks before a formal hearing is scheduled. Maybe longer." She looked at the file. "Magnus will get legal counsel. He already has legal counsel. There will be counters and filings, and all of it will take time. But it's in motion." "It's in motion." She closed the file. "Which means we go back to running the ranch." This was, Colton had come to understand, the most Vivian Ashcroft kind of thing she could possibly say. Not because she was dismissive of what the legal process meant. She wasn't. She understood exactly what was at stake. But because she had spent her entire adult life understanding that the work didn't stop while the other things resolved. The cattle needed feeding in January, regardless of what the territorial court was doing. The North Ridge fencing project didn't pause for legal proceedings. The spring contracts required preparation, whether or not the man who had tried to prevent them from being honored was currently having uncomfortable conversations with his attorney. So they went back to running the ranch. January on the Wyoming High Plateau was the month that separated the people who understood what they'd signed up for from the people who thought they did. The cold was not the dramatic, story-worthy cold of blizzards and crisis. It was the grinding, daily cold of a season that had settled in and was not leaving, that required the same work every day regardless of how you felt about it, that rewarded consistency and punished anything that looked like cutting corners. Colton had organized the winter rotation with enough built-in redundancy that no single bad day could cascade into a crisis. The feed inventory was adequate. The Rollins hay run had made sure of that. The breeding stock was back and healthy, which was not a small thing given what they'd been through. The crew was performing at a level that would have been unrecognizable to the same group of men 3 months earlier. This was not because Colton had transformed anyone. He would have been uncomfortable with that characterization and also found it inaccurate. What he'd done was simpler and harder than transformation. He'd been consistent. He'd shown up every day and done the work the way it needed doing and expected the same from the people around him. And over time, consistency had done what speeches and reorganizations and inspirational management philosophies could not. It had created a baseline that everyone was working from, and that baseline was higher than what had existed before. Cleaver noticed it first, in the way that people who are paying attention notice things. He came to Colton on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of January, which was notable because Cleaver was not a man who sought out conversations with his supervisor unless he had specific business. "The Darnell kid," Cleaver said. "You should know he's been doing more than his assigned work on the east fence line, coming in early, staying late, not asking for extra wages." Colton looked at him. "I know." "I thought you should know I noticed." Cleaver paused, which for him was practically a speech. "That's the kind of thing the old Foreman missed. People doing more than required and getting nothing for it except the satisfaction of being ignored." "I'll talk to him," Colton said. Cleaver nodded and went back to what he'd been doing. Colton did talk to Darnell, but not in any formal way, but in passing, acknowledging specifically what he'd observed and what it meant for the spring timeline. It took about 2 minutes. Darnell didn't make a big thing of it, which was its own sign of character. What Colton understood, and what he would not have been able to articulate without making it sound like a theory, was that people did more when they felt like what they did was seen. Not rewarded necessarily. Reward was a different thing, but seen. The previous management's error had not been cruelty or even incompetence exactly. It had been a kind of blindness to the specific humans doing the specific work. A management of numbers and outputs that lost track of the fact that the numbers were produced by people who had to decide, every day, how much of themselves to put into the job. When nobody notices the difference, people eventually stop making it. He wrote this to no one. He didn't believe in writing things like that down. It was just something he understood in the way he understood fence lines and cattle health, from having been in it long enough to see the patterns. The inquiry notice from the territorial court arrived in the last week of January, and it was more significant than the acknowledgement letter had been. A formal hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of March. The court had reviewed the initial filing and found sufficient basis to proceed. Magnus Granger had 30 days to submit a formal response. Vivian showed Colton the notice after dinner. March, he said. March. She set the paper on the table. Corfield says Magnus's attorney is already in contact with the court. They're going to argue that the fence damage was ordinary deterioration and that Krell's statement was coerced. Coerced how? They'll say we threatened him, or that he made it up to protect himself from charges. She paused. It won't hold, because Krell had nothing to gain from making it up. He had everything to gain from staying quiet if he was operating independently. The only reason to give us information was if he was genuinely acting on instructions and wanted that established on record. Corfield will make that argument. Corfield has already made that argument in the counterfiling he sent this morning. She almost smiled. He's been doing this for 40 years. Magnus's attorney is 42 and very good, but Corfield has tried cases in front of every judge in this territory, and he knows what holds and what doesn't. Colton was quiet for a moment. How are you feeling about it? She looked at him. Honestly? That's what I'm asking. I feel... She paused, and the pause was genuine, the kind where a person is actually taking inventory rather than gathering words they already had. I feel like I've been in a defensive position for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to be the one with the case. She looked at the notice. I'm not comfortable yet. I don't think I'll be comfortable until March is over and there's a ruling. She met his eyes. But I'm not scared the way I was in November. That's different. What changed in November? She looked at him steadily. You know what changed. He did. He didn't belabor it. February came in quietly after the drama of December and January, and there is something to be said for quiet months. They do the work of restoration that the dramatic ones prevent. The Engel breeding stock settled back into their routines. The North Ridge fencing project got properly underway, which meant mornings in cold that required more layers than seemed reasonable, and afternoons where progress was measurable in feet rather than miles. But it moved. The spring contracts were in order. The financial position, reviewed with Corfield in mid-February, was solid. Not comfortable the way Vivian wanted it to be, not flush, but solid, which was the right word for what they'd built through a winter that had tried to take it apart. Hess came by in the second week of February, which was unusual enough to suggest purpose. He accepted coffee at the kitchen table and talked about the spring cattle market and the Territorial Association's upcoming season for 20 minutes before he said what he'd actually come to say. People are talking differently now, he said, about Ashcroft Ranch, about both of you. Vivian waited. The story about the advertisement, Hess paused, which was itself something, because Hess was not a man who chose his words slowly. That story has changed in the telling. It was a joke 6 months ago. It's not a joke now. What is it now? Colton asked. Hess looked at him. It's the story of a woman who put exactly what she needed in plain language and meant every word of it, and of a man who read it correctly and showed up. He drank his coffee. People around here respect that more than they'll admit out loud, because most people are not that clear about what they need, and most people do not show up the way you showed up. He left shortly after, without ceremony, because ceremony was not his mode. After he was gone, the kitchen was quiet in the way it got when something had been said that needed a moment to sit. He's right, you know, Vivian said. She was looking at her cup. About the advertisement. I was very clear about what I needed, and I think I was embarrassed about it, about how direct it was. You shouldn't be. I know that now. She looked up. I was operating from this position that being clear about needing something was the same as being weak, that I should want nothing, or at least appear to want nothing, so no one could use it against me. She paused. Magnus used everything else against me anyway. The only thing he couldn't touch was the thing I'd named outright. Colton thought about that. Because naming it made it yours. Something like that. She was quiet. My father used to say, a want you're ashamed of owns you. A want you've stated owns nobody. She looked at him. He was a practical man. He raised a practical woman. Something in her expression shifted, became briefly unguarded in the way that happened rarely. He would have liked you, she said. He wouldn't have said that. He didn't tell people things like that. But he would have. Colton didn't know what to do with that exactly. So he said, tell me about him. And she did. Not all at once, and not that evening alone, but over the subsequent weeks, in the accumulated way that people tell each other the important things. Not in organized narratives, but in fragments that fit together over time. About her father's habit of walking the perimeter of the ranch every Sunday morning, regardless of weather, because he said you couldn't know what you had unless you walked it. About his opinion of any man who mistreated animals. About the way he'd sat with her for an entire night when she was 17 and her favorite horse had to be put down. Not saying anything particularly useful, but being entirely present, which turned out to be the only thing that mattered. She was not a woman who talked about her grief easily, but she talked about him, and the grief was in the talking, and Colton listened the way he did things, completely, without rushing the silence, without offering premature comfort. In return, without particularly intending to, he told her things. About the 8 years in Colorado and why leaving had felt like losing something he'd never quite named. About the specific loneliness of being competent and reliable at other people's enterprises for your whole working life. About what he wanted, which turned out to be a simpler thing than he'd expected when he said it. Ground under his feet that he was responsible to. Work that added up to something that lasted. Someone he could be honest with without it being held against him. "That's not a small want," Vivian said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him across the table. Do you feel like this is what you were looking for?" He thought about it, which he'd learned meant he was taking the question seriously rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. "Yes," he said. "It is." A pause. "Not exactly what I pictured, but that's usually how it works." "What did you picture?" "Something less complicated." He almost smiled. "I didn't picture a territorial court inquiry." "No," she said dryly. "That does add texture." The March hearing was not what either of them had expected, which was itself something they should have expected, because things that matter rarely resolve the way you picture them. Magnus's attorney was, as Vivian had said, very good. He was precise and well-prepared, and he attacked the weakest links in the chain of evidence with professional thoroughness. Krell's statement, he argued, was the product of a confrontation on private property under circumstances that constituted, at minimum, implicit coercion. The fence documentation, he argued, proved only that fences had been cut, not who cut them. The banking interference, he argued, was Dawson's independent professional judgment and not attributable to any outside party. Each argument was individually defensible. Separately, they were reasonable questions. Together, they were the legal equivalent of what Magnus had been doing all along, finding the seam between what was real and what could be proven and working that seam. Corfield let him finish. Then he put Hess on record. Hess's account of what he'd seen at the ranch and what he'd heard from the men in the Elkhorn Valley was brief and entirely specific, and delivered with the credibility of a man who had no stake in the outcome except accuracy. The judge, a deliberate man named Ostrander, who had been on the territorial bench for 20 years, looked at Hess with the expression of someone who was measuring weight. Then Corfield put Dawson on record. This was the thing Magnus had not been prepared for. Dawson had spent January and February in a gradually worsening position. The partial restoration of Ashcroft's credit, which he'd authorized provisionally at their meeting, had been followed by the full restoration, which he'd authorized because the operational documentation had genuinely supported it. In the process of reviewing that documentation, and in the process of the inquiry's preliminary investigation, certain communications between Pell and a contact at the bank, not Dawson directly, but a junior loan officer who had served as a conduit, had been identified and requested by the court. Dawson had not been party to those communications, but they had happened in his institution, and when he was given the choice between standing behind the communication chain that had influenced the initial credit suspension or telling the court what he actually knew, Dawson chose the thing that an ambitious man ultimately chooses, the side that wins. He testified that the concerns about Ashcroft Ranch's operational stability had been communicated to the bank through a junior officer by a party he identified as connected to the Granger operation, and that those concerns had not originated from any independent assessment of the ranch's actual performance. The room in the territorial courthouse was not large, and it was full. More people had come to this hearing than Vivian had anticipated. Neighboring ranchers, association members, a few people from Laramie who had no particular stake but had followed the story through the social channels it had traveled. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Corfield beside her, and she did not look at Magnus across the room, not because she was afraid to, but because she had decided she was done spending energy in his direction. Colton was in the gallery. She had wanted him at the table, but Corfield had said no. His presence there created a narrative they didn't need, a suggestion that the ranch's case required a man at the front of it. His presence in the gallery, clearly there, clearly the foreman of the operation described in every document before the court, made a different and more accurate point. Judge Ostrander asked her 2 questions directly at one point in the proceedings. Miss Ashcroft, the advertisement in question included what has been referred to as Clause 7. Was that clause in any way relevant to the management decisions that are the subject of these proceedings? No, she said. Clause 7 describes a personal possibility that was available to both parties. It was separate from the employment terms in every operational sense. She paused. The ranch's management improved because Mr. Hayes is competent and honest. The clause had nothing to do with that. Ostrander looked at her. And the clause itself, was it acted upon? Corfield leaned toward her, but she'd already answered before he could frame an objection. That's a private matter, Your Honor, that I'd respectfully note has no bearing on the legal questions before this court. A small sound in the gallery. Not laughter. More like recognition. The sound people make when someone says the right thing at the right moment. Ostrander almost smiled. He made a note and moved on. The ruling came the following week in a written document that Corfield brought to the ranch on a Friday afternoon and read aloud at the kitchen table while Vivian and Colton sat across from him. The court found sufficient evidence of a pattern of deliberate interference with Ashcroft Ranch's operations to support civil liability on the part of the Granger operation. The fence damage, the banking interference, and the cattle theft were found to be connected by a preponderance of evidence. The court ordered compensation for damages to the operation during the period of interference, ordered the return of all documentation related to the cattle movement, and referred the criminal elements, specifically the cattle theft, to the territorial prosecutor for further action. Magnus Granger was not ordered arrested. He was not, in the strict legal sense, found personally criminally liable in this proceeding, because the chain between his name and the specific acts was assembled from connections rather than direct evidence, and Ostrander was a careful judge who would not overreach. But the civil finding stood. The damage amount was substantial, and the referral to the territorial prosecutor meant that the criminal question was not closed. It was pending, which for a man of Magnus's position and social standing was in many ways worse than a concluded finding. He would spend the next 3 years in a slow, grinding legal process that cost him more in legal fees, reputation, and business relationships than the original damages order. Several of his major cattle contracts were quietly not renewed by partners who found the association uncomfortable. The Eastern operation, which had been the conduit for the fence cuts and the cattle theft, was eventually sold under financial pressure. He did not make another offer for Ashcroft Ranch. He never came back into Vivian's office uninvited. Whatever he thought about how things had gone, he kept to himself, which was perhaps the most significant change of all in a man who had always been certain that silence was for people who hadn't yet won. Vivian sat with the ruling in her hands for a long moment after Corfield finished reading. "That's it?" Colton said. Not dismissively, just checking. "That's what the court can do," Corfield said. "The prosecutor may do more in time, but for the ranch's purposes, yes. That's it." He gathered his papers and declined the offer of coffee with the brisk efficiency of a man who had other cases and was satisfied with this one's outcome, and he left. The kitchen was quiet. Vivian set the ruling on the table and looked at it, and then looked past it, at the kitchen wall, at the window, at nothing specific. "My father built this from nothing," she said. "He used to say the land doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about your work." She paused. "I used to think that was just something he said about the ranch. Now I think it's true about everything." Colton was quiet, letting her have the thought. "Magnus cared enormously about his intentions," she said. "He believed he deserved this ranch. He'd convinced himself of it so thoroughly that taking it didn't feel like theft to him. It felt like correction, like the world was misarranged and he was fixing it." She turned to look at Colton. That's what's actually dangerous. Not the greed, the certainty. The certainty that what you want is what ought to be, Colton said. Yes. She looked at him. How do you avoid it? He thought about it. You stay in the work, he said. You keep checking what's actually there against what you think is there. He paused. And you stay honest with the people around you, because they'll tell you when you're wrong, if you've built things right. She looked at him for a long moment. Is that what we've built? I think so, he said. Yes. Spring came to Ashcroft Ranch the way spring comes to Wyoming. Not gently, not on schedule, but eventually, and with a force that was almost argumentative about it, as if the land had decided the winter had gone on long enough and was making the point definitively. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The south pasture went green faster than Colton had projected, which he noted in his records as a positive variance without taking personal credit for it. The Engel breeding stock proved the winter had not set them back. The first calves came healthy, in numbers that matched the spring contract projections closely enough that Vivian revised the annual revenue estimate upward by late April. The North Ridge fencing project was completed in May. Colton walked the entire completed line the day after the last post was set, the way her father had walked the perimeter every Sunday, not to inspect it, because he knew it was right, but because he believed you should know what you had by walking it. The view from the North Ridge on a May morning was considerable. The whole valley below, the ranch building small and solid in the distance, the cattle visible as moving dots in the south pasture, everything working the way it was supposed to work. He stood there for a while. He was not a man given to reflection as a formal practice. He didn't stop to consider his life with any particular regularity, but standing on the North Ridge that morning, he allowed himself to understand what had happened since October. Not the drama of it, not the blizzard in the court and Magnus Granger's long unraveling, but the quieter thing underneath all of that. He had spent 11 years being reliable at other people's enterprises. He had been good at it. He had not been unhappy exactly, but there is a difference between doing good work and doing good work for something that is also partly yours, and he had not understood that difference fully until he was inside it. It was not the land. He had been careful about that from the beginning, and he remained careful about it. The land was Vivian's, built by her father's 40 years in her own, and he had no claim on it and wanted none. But this, the work, the crew that had become something real, the spring that was coming in well after a winter that had tried to prevent it, this was something he was part of in a way that went beyond employment, and he knew it. He walked back down to the ranch. The question of the clause had resolved itself in the way that real things resolve, not in a single conversation, but in the accumulation of mornings, in the way that a person who is building something with someone else stops thinking of the boundary between their work and that person's work as a boundary. Vivian raised it formally on an evening in late April, after the spring contract deliveries were confirmed, and the financial pressure of the winter had finally lifted enough to breathe. She said, "I want to talk about what this is." And he said, "What do you think it is?" She looked at him with the direct, unapologetic look she'd had since the beginning. The look that had been in that advertisement, he thought, had been in it from the first word. "I think it's a partnership," she said, "in every sense of the word, and I think I'd like to formalize that." "Which part?" he said. He wasn't being difficult. He genuinely wanted to know which part she was starting with. "All of it," she said. "But we can start wherever makes sense." He looked at her across the table. "We could start by getting married," he said, as plainly as he said anything. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "We could." They were married in June, at the ranch, with no ceremony beyond what was legally required and a dinner afterward for the crew and the neighbors who had stood by them through the winter. Hess was there. Corfield was there, looking unsentimental and pleased in equal measure. Walt Greer wore his good coat and cried briefly into his hat when he thought no one was looking, and Darnell, who noticed most things, didn't mention it. It was not a fairy tale wedding. Vivian wore a practical dress that she could also wear to town. Colton wore his cleanest shirt and the one jacket he owned. Ferris dropped the ring at the critical moment and had to retrieve it from under a pew in what passed for a moment of ceremony. The dinner went long and loud and ended with Cleaver, and two of the younger hands in a disagreement about cattle breeding theory that was conducted at a volume inappropriate to the occasion, but was, everyone agreed, completely in character. The Laramie Weekly Courier ran a short piece about it. The same paper that had published the advertisement with Clause 7 and had printed the satirical piece about the Ashcroft Matrimonial Employment Bureau now ran 4 inches noting that Miss Vivian Ashcroft had married her ranch foreman, Colton Hayes, following what the editor described as a season of considerable difficulty from which Ashcroft Ranch emerged in stronger condition than it entered. Forsyth, who was still editor, wrote the piece himself. He was not a sentimental man, but he allowed himself one sentence at the end. The advertisement that provoked considerable amusement in this county last autumn appears, on reflection, to have been the most sensible document this paper has published in recent memory. Nobody laughed at it this time. The ranch ran well that summer, and the summer after, and the one after that. Not without difficulty. There were difficult seasons, a dry summer 2 years in that required hard decisions about herd numbers, a winter that tested the North Ridge fencing in ways that found 2 weak points Colton had to acknowledge and repair. The crew turned over, as crews do, but its core held. Darnell became the kind of hand that younger ones watched to understand what the work actually looked like. Cleaver, improbably, developed into a mentor of sorts. Gruff, and not particularly patient, but honest, which turned out to be what the younger hands needed more than patience. Vivian expanded the grazing territory along the North Ridge as she'd planned, which required 2 seasons of infrastructure work and paid out in the 3rd. She kept the books with the same precision she'd always kept them, and she brought Colton into the financial decisions not because he asked to be included, but because she had learned that the best decisions she made were the ones she'd talked through with someone who would push back when she was wrong. He pushed back sometimes. She was wrong sometimes. Neither of those things was comfortable, but they were both necessary, and they had built something solid enough to hold both. There's a thing that people mean when they say a place has a life of its own. They usually mean it loosely. That a house or a town or a piece of land carries the feeling of the people who have been part of it. Ashcroft Ranch had that quality by the time 3 years had passed from the October morning Colton had ridden in on a bay horse with his saddle and his worn tools and his reputation, and it was not a gentle quality. It was earned. It was the feeling of a place that had been tested hard and had not broken. Vivian understood by then what her father had meant about walking the land. She did it herself, Sunday mornings, the way he had, regardless of weather. Sometimes Colton walked with her, and sometimes she went alone, and both arrangements were right in their own way. The perimeter, the water, the cattle in the lower pasture moving in the early morning in their slow, purposeful patterns. The North Ridge fence line, solid, holding. She had begun the whole of it believing that what she needed was protection, someone who could stand between her and the people trying to take what she'd built. She had been wrong about that, and right about it, and the difference between the 2 versions of right was something she thought about sometimes. What she had actually needed was not protection. Protection was what Magnus offered, in his way. The idea that the right alliance would make her safe, that safety came from power positioned correctly. What she had actually needed was someone who would work beside her and tell her the truth and still be there in the morning. Not a shield, a partner. The advertisement had said exactly that, if you read it right. She had read it right, she thought, even before she knew what she was asking for. And one man, out of everyone who could have answered, had read it the same way. She thought about that sometimes, on the Sunday walks, looking at the valley below the North Ridge, at the ranch that was still standing. Not because it was protected, because it was built right, and because the people inside it had decided, each of them in their own way, that what they were building together was worth more than what they could have managed alone, and had done the work to prove it every day in all the ways that mattered and most of the ways that didn't, until it was simply true in the way that the land was true. Solid underfoot, present, not going anywhere. That was the thing about real things. You couldn't take them. You couldn't talk them out of existence or undermine them with legal filings or freeze their credit or steal their cattle in the night. You could only try to build one yourself. And that, as Colton Hayes could tell you, if you asked him, was hard enough work for any one life.